Now, on to the last session, Policy Support Towards Inclusive Crisis. I'd like to call up Marcela Linkova, who will be moderating this session. So Marcela is a researcher at the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Science, where she directs the Center for Gender and Science. She has also been recently elected as co-chair of the ERA subgroup Action 5, and has been actively involved in RESISTIRÉ in precisely developing and promoting our recommendations. Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Colette, and I hope that all of you have enjoyed the lunch and discussing what we were hearing in the morning about digital transition and healthcare in relation to crisis management. And for this hour plus few minutes, we will now be sort of reflecting on what we have been hearing, because we have been hearing stories of resilience and overcoming hardship, but we have been also hearing about how tremendously difficult the situation has been, how the impact was there, especially on vulnerable groups. And we have huge wealth of knowledge that we have been deploying to generate recommendations. And now the time has come to engage with how we can take this further. We have been hearing in the past two sessions also reflections on what we are needing, what needs to happen. And this is precisely the focus of this panel. Because apart from studying the impacts of the crisis on inequalities and how this plays out in the concrete lives of people, our goal was also to gain insight into how policies work, into the policymaking process, into how policymaking can support response and generate solutions, but, and we have been hearing more about this, how policies can fail. And some of them have been failing really badly, as our research shows. And so we have tremendous lessons learned. But before we go into the discussion with our panel, we have two narratives. And I have the clicker here, so hopefully this will work this time. One from Italy and one from Czech Republic.
I am Valeria.
My name is Boris,
children.
and I have been living.
We moved to the Czech Republic. I am Valeria. I have 3 children. We moved to the Czech Republic 4 years ago when my husband got a job here as a software engineer. I'm originally from Russia. The pandemic experience, especially the issue of access to healthcare and being treated as second-class citizens here, became a sort of deal breaker for us. As non-EU migrants with long-term residency, we are not part of the public healthcare system and have to pay for private insurance. Also, the government passed a law last year changing the conditions of private insurance for third country nationals. Now the prices have risen and we are obliged to register with one state-owned insurance company. As we need to pay for the overall period upfront, this is a considerable amount of money, and many migrants struggle to pay it. The state denying us migrants access to healthcare became even more apparent during the pandemic. While Czech nationals had several COVID-19 tests for free per month, we had to pay for a test every time we wanted to use services. I was among the first migrants to get vaccinated. The vaccination for migrants with long-term residency, regardless of their age or health status, opened at the beginning of June 2021, long after the registration was open for all Czechs over 18 years old and for EU citizens and migrants with permanent residency. I had to pay upfront, which was reimbursed to me by my private insurance after approximately 1 month. Our family trusts science, so we wanted to get vaccinated as soon as possible, and we have money to pay upfront. But again, for migrants who work as low-skilled laborers, this might be the money they cannot spare.
My name is Boris, and I have been living in Italy since I was 5 years old. I was born in Macedonia, but I have no nationality. I'm stateless. When COVID-19 hit, I initially had confidence in the government's ability to manage the situation. The lockdown had some positive aspects for me as I could spend more time with my partner. But it also had negative consequences for my work situation. Since I could not go out, I had no way of earning money through petty jobs or begging. Due to the restrictions and the lack of income, my partner and I had to turn to the social services of the municipality for assistance. I must say that we received a lot of help, such as vouchers for groceries or direct financial aid to pay for medicines. My brother and his family also received significant support. There were people who understood our difficulties and were willing to help us without slamming the doors in our faces. I was impressed by the attention and care provided by the Director of Social Services. She welcomed us warmly and assisted us with various issues. In 2021, the social services offered me a community service job as a gardener, paying me €600 per month. I worked for almost a year. For me, the COVID-19 period has been quite positive. I have noticed an increase in community support for those in need. Through my work, I discovered a passion for gardening, which I would like to continue doing.
Okay, so we have heard in these two stories that policy can be a potent enabler and can help people, but it also can have tremendous effects, not only on how they can manage the system, but also on their dignity and where they want to live, for example. So with this, we will be looking in this panel into the challenges and constraints to addressing gender plus inequalities in the policymaking, not only in relation to COVID-19, but also more generally to crisis management. We will be also hearing about positive examples in the policymaking process. And our main goal is to think about what needs to happen for gender plus approaches, perspectives to be integrated, to be made to matter consequentially in the policymaking process. So I will invite to the stage our speakers so that we are all here before the presentation. So I will have to excuse Leticia Thyssen, Senior Policy Analyst for Gender Equality Foundation for European Progressive Studies, who is feeling unwell today and cannot be here with us. But who can be with us is Magdalena Sapala, the policy analyst at Budgetary Policies Unit of the European Parliamentary Research Service. We have also Katarzyna Škuta, EU and International Affairs Advisor to the State Secretary for Gender Equality, Equal Opportunities and Diversity at the Belgian federal government. And we also have Arnold de Boer, Policy Officer at the Secretariat General of the European Commission and representative of the Recovery Task Force. So I'm really happy to have you here. And last but not least on the panel and doing introductions for the RESISTIRÉ findings is my colleague from the Institute of Sociology, Vanda Černohorská, who is the postdoctoral fellow at the Institute.
Thank you, Marcela, for the introduction. So as my colleague Marcela Linková has already mentioned, I have the pleasure and the privilege to provide a very brief 10-minute summary of RESISTIRÉ findings and recommendations that are pertaining to the issue of crisis management and recovery and resilience plans. So see, my task is very easy. The reason why it's easy is that first, as we're nearing towards the end of the conference, you all are at this point very well aware of the need for a European sort of crisis management plan that is not only inclusive, but also gender sensitive. Secondly, the reason why my sort of task is very easy is because we were lucky enough to gather a selection of very interesting panelists. There are experts not only when it comes to crisis management, but also when it comes to the preparation and implementation of the national recovery and resilience plans. These plans were sort of prepared by the member states to kickstart the post-pandemic recovery. However, and that will be the first sort of part of my very short presentation, is that while following the recovery and resilience guidelines of the recovery and resilience facility, most member states sort of introduced some measures focusing on gender equality, but as our RESISTIRÉ research sort of suggests, there is much room for improvement in terms of inclusive preparation for crisis. So just to give you a brief overview of the data that we collected specifically on the issue of crisis management and on the issue of national recovery plans. Through the network of researchers, me being one of them, we analyzed 26 national recovery and resilience plans, audit drafts based on these sort of in-depth analyses coordinated by my dear colleague, Roberto Cebin, we came up with a series of findings, and I will present 4 key findings and then 4 key recommendations to kickstart the upcoming panel discussion. So when it comes to the findings, one of the key takeaways of both the research, but I think also of this conference, is that during the crisis, civil society organizations were playing very crucial role in mitigating the pandemic. And sort of same applies to other crises that we've been witnessing ever since then, such as the refugee crisis that was sort of happening, especially in the Central and Eastern European region as the result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But however, even though these sort of CSOs played such a crucial role within our analysis, we found out that they were often not sort of granted or they were excluded from funding, and they were also omitted in the preparation phase of the national recovery and resilience plans. So the lack of collaboration sort of contributes then to ineffective crisis management and sort of fair recovery. Next finding is that women and vulnerable group representatives were largely excluded from the recovery plans development. So same goes for involvement of feminist organizations. To give you a better understanding of the overall process, each member state was asked to ensure that both researchers as well as civil society representations are fairly included in the preparation process. Unfortunately, it was not really specified in the guidelines the type of the CSOs that should be included, hence feminist organizations, LGBTQ+ organizations, or organizations that are focusing on women's rights were largely excluded from the preparation process through the entire European Union. Secondly, the sort of what we call a gender decision gap has not been present only in preparation of these plans that we will be focusing on during this panel discussion, but it was a big issue also when it comes to the crisis management itself during the pandemic. So you can have a look at the very sort of telling infographic, which shows us that the data on representation of women and vulnerable groups in anti-COVID expert and task forces are embarrassingly low through the entire Europe, as sort of the infographic shows over here. The decision gender gap, sadly, has not been reflected in the National Recovery and Resilience plans. So those plans are offering exactly 0 concrete measures to tackle gender decision gap, even though it is one of the biggest factor that sort of influences the anti-crisis, let's say, response. Okay, on to the third core finding. It's that the National Recovery and Resilience plans do not have intersectional approach. So through the conference, as well as through the project that lasted the past 3 years, we've been repeatedly stressing the importance of intersectional perspective. However, the National Recovery and Resilience plans sadly are considering inequality grounds such as gender or sexual orientation or disability only in isolation, which then hinders the proposed measures. And lastly, the recovery plans fail to address social justice issues, which is a result of all the previous findings that I've been mentioning. So, for example, one of the introductory panel of this conference was focusing on gender-based violence. Sadly, this domain was to a large extent omitted when it comes to concrete actions. And as you can see on the slide behind me, 1/3 of the plans do not have any measures targeting vulnerable groups specifically. Now, this is sort of the brief summary of some of the critical reflections that we've sort of provided in the projects, and now on to the recommendations. I selected 4 of the key ones that will serve as a starting point for the panel discussion. So first and foremost, I presume that you won't be so surprised by the fact that we are advocating for gender balanced decision making, which lies in the core of the inclusive crisis management. Secondly, we recommend gender budgeting. So based on the analysis of the national recovery plans, we found out that the majority of the financial fundings were directed towards male-dominated fields. So female-dominated fields that happen to be that of care and education are notoriously underfunded in the recovery plans. So it has a sort of double negative impact, both on those women that are working in these fields, but also on society and vulnerable groups in general. So we need to ensure fairer distribution of resources and to ensure that needs of all groups, all vulnerable groups, are being met. Thirdly, both when it comes to analyzing the crisis response in general, but also when it comes to looking into in detail how the recovery plans were put together and how they are currently being implemented, there is a significant lack of any sort of gender sensitive monitoring and evaluation. So one of our core recommendations that is also repeatedly stressed in our fact sheets is that we need to ensure that the implementation, that the evaluation will happen at the very beginning of the stage. So even in the planning phase, and then through all the other stages. So we are then able to assess and measure the impact of these measures. Lastly, I mean, I know it's a very general, but at the same time, it's very needed recommendation. We simply need to advocate for gender mainstreaming and for policies that are targeting structural factors of inequalities. So through the recovery plans, we've seen lots and lots of activities that were focusing on tackling sort of individual situation of women or other representatives of vulnerable groups through through individual like educational activities. But one of our main recommendation would be to focus a bit more on a structural and transformative measures that since transformation and inclusive transformation was one of the sort of original thought when putting together the tool of the National Recovery and Resilient Plans. Thank you for your attention, and I am thrilled to pass the mic to our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wanda. I have seen some nodding here on stage when Wanda was presenting the findings, but also recommendations. So maybe I will start by asking if you could introduce concretely what you do in your positions in relation to the topic at hand, and think which of the recommendations perhaps resonates the most, which would highlight the challenges or constraints that you want to stress in the process where we are now. Magdalena, please.
Thank you very much. Works, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here, and I've been here since the morning. And I wanted to say that for me, it's like jumping out of my bubble, because I'm dealing mostly with the EU budget, European Union's budget, EU finance. And here I have heard amazing stories, projects really very impressive. And so it's something that I'm not dealing with on daily basis. Very enriching, impressive. So I hope that our discussion, and I will speak about EU money. So we will go really a bit, down to very practical aspects. And I hope you will also see what you can do in the future and what we can do in our respective workplaces to improve the situation. Because I think that I would subscribe to all of your recommendations and conclusions, unfortunately, because I believe that the Recovery and Resilience Facility could have been an extraordinary and powerful tool to enhance gender equality in the member states. However, it's rather weak in this respect, and several studies show this, not only yours, but recently also EIGE, European Institute for Gender Studies, has presented something new, and I also conducted some studies, and it all is repeatedly the same result. But I don't want to be so pessimistic. Later I will be a bit more optimistic as well. Just to put it a bit in the context of EU budget, I want to say that it's because this accident, I would say, with Recovery and Resilience Facility is because more generally we, in the European budget and EU finance, we still don't have a comprehensive gender financial conditionality, as we have with the rule of law conditionality. And it brings some results already. We don't have a comprehensive gender-based conditionality for the EU finance. So I still miss a bit of this coherence between EU policy and EU finance. And I would say that we still have to do a lot to put our money when our mouth is. Yeah.
Katarzyna, would you care to comment from the Belgian case?
Does it work? Yeah. Okay, thank you for the question. So I will speak from the member states' point of view, but before I speak about Belgium, I would like to also chip in a bit on a more general basis on what Magdalena already said. So pleasure to be with you. this is a very good moment for the discussion. In the conclusions on RRF and gender were passed in the council a couple of well, 2 weeks ago. So there were the conclusions based on the IGA report. So we're discussing in the council what the member states would like to do still with the budgets for the RRF, because we know the plans are already written, but we can still do a bit in the monitoring and the evaluation. But indeed, we have a strong legal base for gender mainstreaming, and there's the whole Article 8 in the Treaty on Function of the European Union. And I can say that there are many policies of the EU that have weaker legal bases, and they're doing well. But with the gender mainstreaming, we have a problem. We have still a problem of really using the legal basis up to its potential. So definitely, I agree with Magdalena that we could do better. And this is what the Court of Auditors said in 2021. This is what IGA says. And when we started drafting the regulation on the RRF, everybody was just had this tunnel vision. You know, like we have to go out, we have to go to recovery. What do we do? It's the twin transition, so digital and green. And actually, the conditionality that was put into the regulation was put very, very at the last, and was actually on the insistence of the FAM committee, which, and I would like to make here a bit of a outside comment, is that we need. I work for the State Secretary for Gender Equality, so our role in the government is to look at the other members of the government, is like, don't forget gender equality and equal opportunities. This we have in the Parliament. We have FAM committee. At the Commission, we have first a Commissioner for Equality. We don't have it in the Council, so we have to fend a bit for ourselves. When we invited as representative of member states for gender equality, we are there, but we are always at the table, and specifically not when it comes about the big budgets. So we have to be at the table, and this is why I really like your recommendation about the gender representation, because I think it's very important, but also having this position of gender equality in every level of power. So there's someone that really monitors and evaluate the policy from this perspective. And this happens in Belgium because we have a gender mainstreaming law with plans, but this is not always the case. And as you said, Magda, as well, that the mention is there, but we don't have targets. So we have 20% for digital, we have 30% for climate, and for gender equality. Well, write me what you doing for gender equality, but you don't have to show how much money is going there. So this is the problem. If there were a target, would have seen more money, would have seen how the money is really spent on gender equality, but at least would have seen the money. So I think this is important. We need statistics, and we need the budget that goes with it, because otherwise we'll just get a really nice looking page on gender equality in the RRF.
Thank you very much. Arnold, I don't want you to sort of feel on the spot with all the findings that we have, but I think that it would be really important to understand how the whole policy process comes and what are the constraints under which you operate, and how that sort of resonates with the criticisms and the findings that you've been hearing, you know, how that comes together.
Yeah, with pleasure, and many thanks also for having invited us. And before, we've also been in touch on the findings actually of the RESISTIRÉ project, and we were already very impressed back then also on the quality of the analysis and the different angles you took to approach the issue. And that's really useful, and that's actually one of the things that we need a lot. Before I will get back to the recommendations that resonate most, I think indeed it would be helpful to explain a bit where I work and what we do in the context of the of setting up the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So I work in the Recovery and Resilience Facility Task Force in the Commission. So it was a crisis instrument task force that is still functioning as a crisis task force, I would say, at the moment. We thought at some point, once COVID is, let's say, over, we would no longer be in a crisis mode, but somehow that doesn't go away as long as the instrument exists, which is formally until 2026. when this started, we, even at the personal level, we were all working from home until we were officially designated as critical staff, meaning that we were allowed to come to the office if needed, because it was sometimes very much needed. But I remember sitting also during summer completely alone in my apartment, sweating and not being able to go out. And in the meantime, working on developing, helping member states develop their recovery and resilience plans. It was very big constraint. Nothing compares, of course, to anything that has been discussed over the past 2 days here. I mean, I wasn't here, unfortunately, until the lunch break today, but I saw the topics that have been discussed. I saw also several of I followed the presentations just now as well, and it was incredibly interesting. And also those narratives you presented, it's very touching and very concrete. And we've tried, of course, to take that into account. But what happened at that moment was, of course, the fact that we were all, it was a deep crisis. It was, first of all, a health crisis. It's then evolved into several other types of crises in various policy areas. And the idea was then to recover in terms of economic and social resilience. And to be honest with you, I actually agree that I think that the main, the dominant factor here has been the economic recovery. That's very clear, because the whole point was also to give, first of all, a very clear signal to the financial markets. I know that's completely far away from your policy domain, but it was super important that at the European level, we gave that signal and that we made sure that it didn't become an economic crisis, which then, will multiply the crisis also on the social level later on. We had other instruments in place first as well, the unemployment reinsurance system, and then which was just to make sure that people didn't lose their jobs during the crisis. But then afterwards, we needed to transition. And indeed, the focus has been on the twin transition, on the green and digital transition, because those were identified as the areas where we also have a lot to gain. And I think in that sense, rightfully so. But in the context of this crisis situation, indeed, I won't say we actually forgot, we didn't, but it was very hard to include in a well elaborated way the social dimension. I mean, just to nuance one of the messages, it is completely true, and I fully agree, there was no gender criterion, even in our original proposal of the Commission. This is completely correct. It came from the Parliament, actually, which we then supported. But of course, it should have been there from the beginning. That's my personal take on that. But it's also very difficult to do that. What we do have, so aside from the 37% on green transition and the 20% criteria to contribute to digital transition, we do have other policy pillars. So for instance, the pillar on social and territorial cohesion, there was no criterion attached to it, but there was a pillar that we can now identify, and it's close to 30% of the total spending that is being spent in the area of social and territorial cohesion. That's not to say we did enough. By far not. It's not to justify anything, but it is sometimes important to look at that picture as well, because what was incredibly difficult is looking back now. I'm really speaking from right here, right now. What was incredibly difficult in hindsight, I think, is to come with very tangible things and measures to improve specifically gender equality, or equality in a much wider sense, to improve equal opportunities for also for vulnerable groups. Many of those policy objectives were, first of all, the competence of member states. So there we could not easily add things at the European level. This was up to them to decide how they would spend the money. And also, if you look at how the money is spent and how you've then tried to also monitor in implementation and push for at least making sure that in the implementation phase, member states spend the money within their overall objectives, also towards addressing specifically vulnerable groups. We also looked at the reforms. One very important aspect of the whole recovery and resilience facility is the fact, and this is really new in comparison with other financial instruments that the Commission has, is the strong link with the country-specific recommendations in the context of the European semester. This is a process for economic and social policy coordination in Europe. We come up with policy recommendations every year, and they had some teeth before, but not that much. And now for the first time, we actually had them very directly integrated in a regulation to make sure that member states address all or significant subsets of the country-specific recommendations. And these also include many aspects that have been highlighted for years, addressing structural problems in the area of inequalities. And I think this is a very crucial aspect to keep in mind. And this is what we've also conveyed as messages whenever stakeholders, researchers are analyzing what has been done in the context of the RRF. It's very difficult, first of all, so well done on what you have done to measure the impact and measure how the money is spent. But even for us, it was nearly impossible to do so because we cannot know. We cannot know for many measures in the social policy area to which extent they will benefit, for instance, women in particular. They will. I'm 100% sure of that. If you do a reform of long-term care, I'm convinced that it will increase the labor market opportunities of women. It will also relieve the burden on informal carers, which are predominantly women, just as an example. But we cannot measure that, especially not in advance. So that would be great, of course, if that we can do it afterwards. I'll stop here for this part. Sorry for already taking too long, but I think it was important to provide some context. And just to say that I think the part on the budgeting, that's where the recommendations from your side resonate the most. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introductory statements. And before I ask if you want to react to one another, I want to highlight one thing that it continues to really strike me is we have gender mainstreaming as the EU policy. We have had it, I don't know for how many decades. And yet we still can come up with policy solutions where gender is not mainstreamed from the start. And I think that we need to keep reminding ourselves that right now we're with a commission that is perhaps the most gender-prone, gender-sensitive European Commission that we have ever had. The issue is on the agenda, and still this is something that happens. And I think that this is fairly alarming that we're not used to integrating gender in the policy design from the start, much less gender plus intersectional approach. And so I think that this is a point that we should keep in our minds for all the future endeavors. But please, Magdalena, do you want to react to what Arnold was saying?
Yes, okay. I'm of course happy that you mentioned the European Parliament's role, being from the Parliament. And just wanted to maybe also explain to the audience that the rules for spending the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which are included in the regulation, special document for this instrument, they have a general requirement. Yes, they include a horizontal criterion, one can say, yes, that member states, thanks also from thanks to the European Parliament and some active women's lobbying organizations, this was included in the rules that horizontally member states should take this into account, show what are the challenges and how measures will respond. However, of crucial importance is what is missing. What is missing in the regulation, and it's also what you've already said partly. We miss a very concrete, specific criteria on gender equality related measures, reforms, and investments. And that's exactly what I was looking for in all the national recovery plans when I prepared my analysis that is also published, so you can check it later on the website of the European Parliament. I looked for very specific milestones and targets, because it's not enough to have a training, ICT training. Yeah, we need to know how many women are going to take part in this ICT training. And I was looking for this kind of projects. And if there is a subsidy to help people on the labor market, I want to see a project where women will be subsidized to learn how to become a driver of a public transport. Yeah, so this kind of examples, and then these were very rare in the plans, in the national recovery plans. I had 3 groups. I managed to see 3 groups of countries, because it's not all fault of the European Commission that didn't put it, or the European Parliament that didn't manage to put more of, but member states, and where you are also working at your level, this has to be included. And these 3 groups of countries, just to finish, the biggest and the worst, I would say, is the group of countries. 13 countries didn't mention anything about, you know, women or gender equality. Nothing. I couldn't find anything. 9 countries included 1 or 2, 3 measures, or where women were very concretely mentioned as beneficiaries. And the best group are 5 countries, Belgium among them, where there was more significantly on this very poor background, against this very poor background, it was significantly important, innovative ideas. And these good countries, I will now tell which they are, because these are really worth mentioning. And it's Italy, Spain, Estonia, Austria, and Belgium. So these are really places where some things are going to happen or are already taking place.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, if I might, what you said, Anno, about the European semester, I was sitting as one of the country experts for some time. So I see the country-specific recommendations, but I think we're moving from the semester that was really a macroeconomic tool towards something that is more socially also driven. And I think this is also important to have in the European semester. And I haven't seen one, but I would like to see gender experts sitting on the semester as well, you know, like specifically. But I'm sure we'll come in it, and Belgium during presidency will work a bit, and it was also the objective of Spain to work on this, on deepening the social impact of the semester, because I think this is one of the tools that we can really work as a member states with the Commission on reforms, and this is that I really agree about that. But I think when negotiating between the member states, but also within our own government, you know, like the better regulation or the stricter regulation is, then the more, of course, arguments you have when you argue with other ministers. And it's, believe me, it's not simple, because everybody wanted the money for their own policy purposes. And of course, everybody had like many infrastructure projects that were to be financed, and then you come with innovative, more creative, gender transformative projects and say, yeah, but this is training and we have to build a road, or, you know, so when you don't have this regulation that is really strict, it's a really difficult discussion, and then we come to the thing. But you know, we made this exercise, and I think this is important that the project as RESISTIRÉ brings the evidence, and then hopefully we'll do better next time.
So I think that this is so fantastic and important, because I think that the European semester has been blind, gender blind for so long. And I mean, any effort to bring gender into it has, I mean, so far been unsuccessful. So, I mean, thank you for mentioning this presidency priority. I think that if this goes forward, that would be really fantastic. Maybe if we can go back to the positive examples and sort of transition to what the positive side of things that we can take out of this. So Magdalena, you have already been mentioning the countries that have fared fairly well. And I would say it's not the typical usual suspects that we have on gender equality policy countries. We have countries that do not typically come up in the indexes, maybe in all the instances that you have been mentioning. So this is also good news, I think. Katerina, would you like to continue maybe with what you would like to highlight in terms of the Belgium case as the positive development that you wish to stress?
Yeah, thank you, Martina. So first of all, when the state secretary came into power. So it was the first gender equal Belgian federal government. So it was the first state secretary of this portfolio. Before, the portfolio was just attached to something else. And you know how it is when you have a big portfolio. Of course, you give a thought to all the things in your portfolio, but it's not your only goal. So it was the fact. And so the coalition came into power during just before the second lockdown. So we already seen the effects of the first lockdown, but we're going through the second wave. So maybe facing a second strict lockdown, we didn't know still because we were looking at the data. So one of the first thing that we did is a specific action plan on gender-based violence. And because we already knew that the lockdown had a big effect on the spike of gender-based violence, especially at home. So the first thing was to give more money to the shelters, but also open up temporary shelters for victims. What we also wanted to say to the victims is that there's no curfew that is being applied to the victims that are fleeing domestic violence. And we also spoke with the police, and we actually put it now as a current policy, is that there is a follow-up with the police with the victims that have filed a complaint. So there's a call-up 3 months after, just to see how the situation goes. So this was a specific plan that we have done with the money of the Belgian government, but we had already the idea of, you know, that there's something going on. So when we were discussing the plans for REF, we knew as well that we'd like to have a more specific approach. So our administration is the Institute for Gender Equality. It's both an equality body and administration of the state secretary. And they had already a very large experience with gender mainstreaming. So we said, okay, so we just put you on the task force as well, and you will have a look on what the others are presenting. So they were part of the task force. They were doing an analysis of the projects ex ante. So we had this in the RRF, the projects that were positive, that they had a potential effect, and then there were gender neutral. We didn't have projects that were negative. And so this was more as a kind of a horizontal outlook, and we will do it during the evaluation. But we also provided a training, a gender mainstream training to the administration. And finally, we had a project specific on employment of vulnerable women. So this was also the specific money that went. I have to say that we have problems with spending it properly, because it's a small project, it's 3 million compared to other big infrastructure. And since it's a small project, so there's a lot of requirements on that. So we see sometimes you would prefer to, go for 50 million than 3, because on the reporting basis, sometimes it's challenging.
Thanks. Yeah, no, indeed, that I can only imagine. I don't work personally on the Belgian plan. I work on Slovakia myself. We have a very strange matrix structure that I won't try to explain to you, because we don't even understand it ourselves. But we work, aside from horizontal topics, and in my case on social affairs, equal opportunities, also on country teams. So working directly with the counterparts in the national administrations. But I don't work with the Belgian team, but I hear good things from their side. So. No, indeed, I think so. I mean, maybe first of all, what we did as a commission to also map basically what has been done in this area. We presented early this year a thematic analysis on equality. I can just show you how it looks like, and it looks like this. And I hope maybe somehow the link can be shared after this, because I think it's also a really interesting insight in the analysis of how the process came about, how we tried to include what are the requirements and the angles that we did have as Commission, also to push member states to do more, and what we didn't have, although that we couldn't write so much, of course, but still, but also then analyzing in the various areas what member states contributed. I think you're right in general that there are a few member states that clearly had a much more direct approach to including a gender perspective into the national plans. At the same time, there are many others who also included things that are, and here, okay, we I don't think we have to argue about methodology, but of course here the problem arises simply because of how do you measure exactly the impact of whatever measure you undertake. In some cases, member states include a specific, in your case, for instance, on gender-based violence, a specific measure dedicated to this. In other cases, member states said, well, they had an investment in education, for instance, digital upskilling, and they said as a sub-target, a certain amount of women at least should be part of this training exercise, which was a very simple but very effective way to make sure that at least there is a push also in the green transition, for instance, the upcoming technologies, that there at least women will be well represented. So that's, I think, was a very good example of what was done. And in other cases, it was actually the mainstreaming. So from the very start, looking at the budgeting aspects, and there are then, especially in a crisis situation, you have to fall back on what exists. And that's, of course, then you have to rely on member states that already have that in place, who already look at it from a horizontal perspective at everything they do, every euro that is spent, to which extent that contributes to equal opportunities. And some of them really did that. And some of them actually introduced, as part of the measures in the national plans, a reform to introduce this. And Spain is a very good example of this. Spain has, I have to say, really several very good, interesting measures that will also have a very good lasting impact in the long run. At least that's what's expected. We can't promise, but that's the idea. I would also refer to Italy, where, at least in the context of the RRP, I have to say specifically, there they had very interesting approach. They also introduced, for instance, a gender certificate in the context of companies to be awarded in procurement. And this is a very interesting aspect. And I think in the context of budgeting, we should look also, and I'm anticipating a bit on the last part perhaps of the discussion, but in the area of procurement, there is really a lot to be done. And when we now say, and I really mean this, when we now say that measures were or were not included in the national plans, it's not a fait accompli. It's not yet done. Measures are still being designed and developed and implemented, and calls for tenders are still being drafted. When calls for tenders are drafted, it's so important that that's where you have relevant stakeholders present. This we cannot impose from the side of the Commission. We encourage, and we do this constantly. Also in the context of Repower EU, this new chapter that member states are currently adding, there's another angle that you can try. It sounds like far away from social policy area, but in the area of energy poverty, energy efficiency, and so on, there is so much to be done. Sustainable transport. If you increase sustainable transport in cities, it's likely to help women relatively more than men. This scientifically proven, and these are elements that are incredibly important. And so aside from the level of measures, really go into the level of detail, go into the measures themselves, the investments that are still being developed and implemented, and make sure that as civil society organization, you are part of the process. Member states might not always be the one to reach out to you, but you, and I can't say much about that. It will have to be sometimes you yourself doing that in this situation. That said, I should have maybe done it in a different order. I want to just highlight one thing, that in terms of data, we do have in the regulation also monitoring and reporting obligations. For instance, to disaggregate certain data, the final beneficiaries by gender. So 4 out of the 14, and that's not maybe not enough to be discussed, definitely. But 4 out of the 14 types of data on which the final beneficiaries need to be reported have to be disaggregated also by gender. So this is, for instance, about the number of researchers benefiting from measures, the number of people in education and training, the number of young people receiving employment support, or also in vocational training. So those areas, at least there is some reporting obligation, but there as well, it's important to further develop, of course.
Thank you for sharing these examples of where it has been working. I think that what you were just saying, Arnold, when saying you have to reach out to the national authorities or member states, I think that that's one of the findings that we have had, that there is no interface through which this can happen at the national level. And so I think that we are sort of in a situation where, in a way, blaming the victim, maybe if there are no avenues for this to happen, because the CSOs have started responding from the research that we have. And so I think that we need to think of better ways how to create those interfaces. And so I think that maybe for the lessons learned, the third part of our discussion, this is also something that we can touch upon, where that is in place and how to establish those interfaces so that they kick in when something like this happens, or even better, to have them as a normal part of the policymaking process, because this is something that we have been hearing about from the start of today. But Wanda, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, lots of interesting things were said. Maybe I would like to follow up on what Magdalena was saying in terms of that she wants to see reforms and investments, and also a little bit on what Arnold was saying about the specific measures, the good examples that he was mentioning. So my experience is that I was doing an in-depth analysis of the Czech National Recovery Plan. So I'm fairly familiar with the process in my home country. And but obviously this sort of conclusions apply to many other countries that are in Magdalena's group number one of those states that didn't really perform well in putting together the National Recovery Plan. So the one thing that we were missing to a large extent is any sort of transformative potential. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the Resilience and Recovery Plan, and obviously this is very simplistic, but imagine that member states were sort of given a large sum of money, and they were told to be bold and come up with something that is transformative. That's the key word. They will provide long-term structural change that will strengthen the resilience of the society. And oftentimes, and that is unfortunately the case of the Czech Republic, there's nothing transformative to when it comes to many of the measures that were proposed, especially when it comes to gender equality. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, there is only one, as in one measure pertaining to gender equality that has been introduced in the plan. And that is a measure that has been sitting around for quite some time. It was taken out of someone else's desk, dusted off, and just put in the plan. And that is the financing of a children's group for children younger than 3 years old. And obviously this is the bare minimum that needs to be put in place in order for strengthening gender equality on the labor market and mitigating gender care gap. But this is also an issue that has been paid for through the European structural funds consistently through the past 2 program periods. And the European Commission has been repeatedly telling to the national government that this has to be paid from the national budget. Yet the national government put it as the only sole measure when it comes to gender equality into the plan. And I think it's a sort of a good example of how, even though there has been some concrete measure, the transformative potential is not really there. So maybe a sort of a lesson learned for if there's going to be another opportunity for this transformative exercise, that the task force really looks into the structural impact, the transformative impact that hasn't been really there. And last thing that I wanted to say, I want to second to what Arnold was saying about that some measures are still being put into the plan. So we've done lots of work, and now I'm going to boost a little bit, but we've done lots of work in trying to sort of communicate the recommendations that are coming from the RESISTIRÉ project on the national level. And we've done lots of work when it comes to advocating for including more anti-gender-based violence measures, using the examples of countries like Belgium and others and their national recovery plans. And we are actually at the moment in process into inserting more of these concrete measures that weren't there before. So the window of opportunity is not entirely closed yet.
if I may, still in the chapter lessons learned, I think that one of the issues was that maybe in some cases, in some member states, in this situation of crisis, and really when we now recall it, and you recalled it very well now, Arnold, that it was so difficult moment. There were no ready-made, on the shelf somewhere, examples of projects, transformative, innovative, because these kind of projects exactly were necessary for this particular facility, because this facility is concentrated on green and digital transformation. So here, gender equality at first glance is like, oh, so how we are going to marry the two, yeah? So to find ideas like this, to marry the two or three, digital, green, and gender equality, you need some innovative thinking. So that the lesson learned, one of lessons that indeed we should have a bit more of this in our pocket already, on our shelf or on our pocket, and come up with them to the government when it's necessary.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we are transitioning to the recommendations for the future. Thanks for these outlines already. And I will ask you also to think about, either what would it be your suggestions or questions to the panel, because we will open for questions after this third round of interventions into, what needs to happen from your perspective to make gender plus matter in the policymaking. What needs to happen for us to do it better next time something like this hits, or as normal process of policymaking?
You can start.
I will start. Okay. Yeah. No, with pleasure. This is, of course, the most difficult question, and what I'm happy about is that we all of us, we recognize that yes, it was a very difficult situation, and indeed, this is exactly the putting, yeah, I'm looking for the English expression now, the finger where it hurts. But the fact that it was, no one saw this coming, and then indeed there were no ready-made innovative or transformative projects on the shelf. I would say in the context of policy making, what we did have was the European semester. I think this was our, I won't say luck, because it was there with a reason, but this was our main angle. But I also remember very well that, and I'm really talking about how we concretely had to work on it. We had those recommendations, but if you compare the recommendations made over the past 10 years, or let's say before 2020, and the ones made in the past few years, you'll see the difference in how detailed they now are. Because suddenly, and that happened in the context of the development of the national plans, we had to get so much country-specific knowledge, not only in the various commission departments, but also at the level of the Secretariat General, where we drafted, where we are based in the task force. We suddenly became all experts recently on energy policies. I studied history myself. I know nothing about energy policies. I didn't know, but I know now. But this was, we had to do so much and push everyone so much to get this info also from member states and push them to think about what they could possibly do. But that's no excuse. Indeed, now it's the time to think also ahead. Indeed, let's hope we don't have the occasion, in the sense that there won't be a real crisis. But if something like that happens, or even for whatever happens with the next European budget, it's important that of course we look at what kind of measures can be transformative, and not just investments. Because personally, I feel sometimes, and it's rightfully so, and I think for the audience as well, the most tangible element of this whole story is about the investments, because that's concrete money that can go to your organizations to implement projects that you have. But at the same time, the most transformative things are sometimes also at the level of very boring reforms that have a lasting impact only in the longer run. But they have to be ready, and we have to think about that. So that's one thing that we have to give more teeth to the semester. And linked to that, I also think that we need more work on indicators in that sense, to make sure that we know all the stories you just presented before we started this panel. If these things have to reach the policymakers, This is the crucial element, because at the moment we were drafting the plans together with member states. We didn't know the impact yet on every specific group and what was happening to them. And everyone, of course, had their own stories and their own family and friends, what happened to them. But especially when people were part of various, let's say, disadvantaged groups, women, migrants, disabled women, I don't know, that's even multiplied many factors, migrant workers who have no access to healthcare. These kind of things, those are stories that you know, we just don't know that. We didn't know that at the beginning. It was very difficult to translate that into direct policy making. But this is the kind of information we need then as well. And also at the level of indicators, what happens a lot, and this is also, personally, I'm really attached to this. We have indicators on the social policy field, and they feed into, you know, the level of people at risk of poverty and social exclusion, and so on. And that's very well developed, and it's, you know, it's improving, but we don't always divide them into various groups. And sometimes that's needed, because the average indicators can be great, and we see inequalities have not increased, but you zoom in on specific groups and they have incredibly increased. So, and as long as those messages don't reach the policymakers, we are nowhere. So we need researchers, we need CSOs to have those messages ready, have the analysis ready to be prepared, and make sure that we pay attention to that, basically. One other thing, and I have to mention, is that in September, we will publish in the Commission the next annual report, which also includes a section on equality, which zooms in on what is already being implemented in the area of equality. And another very great thing is that, maybe you know probably more about this, is the Council conclusions that were very recently, last week, almost adopted on gender budgeting, and with very concrete recommendations in this area, which is incredibly important, because it's a concrete tool. It's no binding implementing legislation, but it's a very concrete tool where member states will now have to report on a regular basis. This is very important. I think that's basically it, what I wanted to say. I will leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Before passing the floor, I will have a very concrete question. What would be the instrument, the tool to pass the narratives to the policymakers? Like recorded book of the narratives. We have a wonderful book of better stories now coming from the project, which would speak to different types of experience. So what, from your perspective, would be the tool how to get those stories there?
Yeah, here I am.
Podcast, I mean, recorded
idea.
messages like this, please.
Yeah.
I mean, I have an idea for the European Parliament, what works best. There are members of the European Parliament, each of you know in your country. You have to reach out to them. And from your perspective of coordinators of the projects, reach out not only to the members of the European Parliament, of the FAM committee, because they are really well educated in all this, but reach out to those who are in the budget committee. Exactly. I mean, we are very lucky because some of the members of FAM committee are also members of the budget committee, and that is very important for what I have said at the beginning, to have really comprehensive budgetary gender conditionality, so more broadly. And we can introduce this at the EU level, at least, to the EU budget, with the new multi-annual financial framework, which will be, we start negotiations or preparations already now. So it's now the time to talk about it. Now it's time to be loud and say, yes, we need concrete criteria. Yes, we need gender conditionality. Yes, we need also gender budgeting, which is already relatively well advanced, relatively to what has been so far, because so far even EU budget has not been screened in terms of gender impact. So this is changing, and it's already better than it was before. And I'm sure that during the next round of MFF, multi-annual financial framework, negotiations, gender equality will be very important aspect. And it's really the moment to make sure that it's visible and that the members of the European Parliament know about it and they hear your voice. However, take into account, that will be my last remark, we have elections to the European Parliament next year in June. And now we have to, it's in the citizens' hands. Who will be elected to the European Parliament? There are also many elections at the national level this and next year. This is all in the people's hands, because on this, then we can do with this material that will be selected by the people, we in the European Parliament can do something, and I hope that the future European Parliament will be supportive for gender equality.
We all do. It's not only the European Parliament, it's multiple elections across Europe. I mean, it is a taxing time, but indeed, Katerina.
So just to add up to what Magdalena said, we are also starting the reflection on the strategic orientations for the next commission. So this is in the hands of member states now. So there's also a very interesting discussion. So be there as well. Try to influence this discussion, because this will be adopted in June next year after the elections, but it will be a document that the new commission will get as a basis for their new program. So this is important. Commission just asked the member states for more money, so this is also a moment when we will discuss the conditions of the new budget. So there's always an interesting moment when you can fit in. I think what is also important is that IGA is now working on the gender perspective in the Green Deal, and as you said, Magdalena, we're talking about the twin transition, but we're treating it often as a gender neutral thing, but it's not. It's far from gender neutral. So if you want to have not only gender sensitive policies, but gender transformative policies, and I think this is where we're going, really want to really tackle this underlying norms and behaviors that are really the root of inequalities in our society, then we need gender transformative policies. But there are not many people to know how to build a policy, energy policy that is also gender transformative. So yeah, I think we need more reflection on that. We need more projects that help us, but also we need a dialogue with the civil society. So this is what we did as well in the government, that we really want to involve civil society at every stage of the policy cycle. And what we did as well with our gender mainstreaming law, and I think this was a very good idea, is that we had a gender mainstreaming law that was passed in 2007, but then we've seen that, it was on the paper, but, the governments were looking at that and just having an annex to every plan saying, yeah, this is the gender impact. So what we did is ask every minister, based on the civil society consultation, we asked them, pick in your portfolio, in your plans, measures that are most likely have a gendered impact, and then we will stick to it. So we had approximately 150 measures that were put forward by with all the ministers from the government. And now we have a specific task force that is monitoring this gender mainstreaming on this specific thing. So we don't have a gender mainstreaming on all policies. Well, we do have, but here we're really looking into it more closely. And this enables us also to put this, this thought in all the ministers and ministries as a project. I think this is also pick up your fights.
Yeah, this is a very good example. I really like this because it's a concrete push also to the every single ministry, and this is something we encountered also in discussions with the member states. That sometimes, the coordinating body who were our direct interlocutors, they were often convinced of things, but then they go to the individual ministries and they have no idea how to integrate equality considerations in their measures. This is difficult. What we did on the Commission side quite recently is actually we have this RRF expert group. So the experts from the member states who are working on the Recovery and Resilience Facility, mostly financial people, invited to an event on equality mainstreaming in the implementation and the revision of the national plans. And we also invited their experts from the national ministries online, members of high-level groups on non-discrimination and on gender mainstreaming. And this was kind of unprecedented that financial people, well, in general, I would say almost that financial people talk to people who are more experts in equality. And this was really, it was incredibly interesting. It was also clearly a first time that they talked together, and with hope, of course, for more discussion, but it was a very good event because it allowed us to show what can be done in terms of mainstreaming equality considerations. There was a simple, in the green policy area, there was a simple example of, for instance, one member state building, I think, a renewable energy plant close to an area with high share of low income groups, let's put it that way. And they were allowed then to benefit from the electricity production as well, for some percentage, which was very interesting. So it's in the field of green transition that you would never think about, where you can actually integrate equality considerations. So this was the kind of thing that we're also trying to do. We have, of course, the requirement also for the Repower EU chapter for member states to explain how the measures contribute to gender equality and how they involved and incorporated feedback from stakeholders. But indeed, that's not an obligation to actually do it. And yeah, that's not. So this is also where I would say for the way forward, it's important that the messages are being created now so that they are ready whenever you need them. Already in process, indeed, as you said, for the next multi-annual budget, and for whatever situation hits us next. So that's incredibly important. We will have a midterm review of the RF coming up in February 2024, which will ask very fundamental questions on the functioning of the RRF, and also, of course, look at the impact of the measures included in the plans on equality. And I would say stay tuned for that, because it's going to be, first of all, a very good indicator of what's going to happen next. And it will include probably very interesting insights. So,
thank you very much. So you are realizing that we are not managing discussion because we have just run out of time, for which I'm very sorry. But thank you very much for the contributions and the sort of highlights for where to put the attention for the future. I'm taking monitoring and evaluation as a crucial element, but this is really on the policymakers' side, because if we do not put, as we discussed, indicators and processes in place, then there's nothing really that we can say about the process. And I think that the midterm review is, when you say stay tuned, I think maybe on the policymaker side, also stay tuned to the outputs that are there research-wise, such as RESISTIRÉ, so that can all be implemented, because now we have such a huge wealth of knowledge. And I think that the onus also needs to be on the policymaking side, not just on researchers and CSOs making themselves heard and trying to ask permission to be heard. I think that the mention of the council conclusions on the budgeting and also the next multi-annual framework, that's also very important. And I think that, yes, those are the crucial battlefields for the future. So thank you very much for this discussion, for the contributions, and thanks for listening to this. And once again, sorry for not having the time for questions, but maybe this can happen after the end of the conference, after the close. Thanks.
Thank you so much for setting time aside to come. We know that your time is precious. As you appreciated the narratives and the better stories, well, we have the pleasure and honor of giving you each a book that we have just released yesterday of 80 narratives that we have put together in a book. We had the budget, talking of budget, we had the budget within the project to publish 100 copies. So you have 1 out of 100 copies printed. If you have an idea of, of a way to print more, you're welcome to share. So we hope that you appreciate that and share it with anyone who could be interested. Thank you very much. A round of applause for our external speakers.